Hello. In this video, I want to go over divine command theory and an argument that has been influenced by the Euthyphro dilemma that we'll call the argument against divine command theory. So first, in order to understand what divine command theory is, and in particular the argument that's levied against divine command theory, it is first important to get a picture of what the argument is supposed to be, or the problem that the argument is supposed to be highlighting against divine command theory. In order to do that, we have to have a clear conception of the Abrahamic God. Now, the Abrahamic God is the God of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And throughout the millennia, there has been many ways of characterizing or conceptualizing who God is. But for the most part, it's safe to say that God is generally conceived as just this entity that's just one and eternal, omnipotent, meaning being all powerful, omniscient, meaning being all knowing. It's the creator of the universe, right? And amongst other things, God is said to be perfectly rational as well as sovereign, meaning he's the individual entity that is in control of all of his creation. So, out of all of these characteristics that we maintain God has, we're going to be focusing on two characteristics. These are going to be key for the argument against divine command theory. And those are the characteristics of perfect rationality and sovereignty, right? So, again, the idea here is that God, the Abrahamic God, the way we conceive him, essentially has all of these characteristics. And any entity that lacks any of these characteristics cannot be said to be the Abrahamic God, because the Abrahamic God, again, essentially has all of these, right? And so, kind of a preview of how the argument is going to turn out is the argument against divine command theory is going to try to demonstrate that if divine command theory is true, and I'll explain what divine command theory is in a little bit, then it would require that one of these two characteristics be kind of taken away from God. Or in other words, if divine command theory is true, then it can also be the case at the same time that God has all of these characteristics, in particular, perfect rationality and sovereignty. So, in addition to all of the characteristics that I just discussed, it is also said, or it's also believed, that the Abrahamic God, in some sense, grounds moral principles through his commandments. But what does this really mean? Like, how do we interpret that, that God is in some sense responsible for morality, and then the commandments are some sort of reflection of those commandments? In other words, there are two possible ways of interpreting this. And one of them is that, well, is it the case that certain things are going to be moral, certain moral principles, or sorry, certain moral acts will be moral because God commands them? Or is it the case that God commands certain things, certain acts, because those acts are said to be moral? And now, this is a distinction that's important here, because the distinction, right, depending on how you answer this question, is going to determine the sort of version or conception of divine command theory that we are adopting. So let me see if I can clarify this. So define divine command theory as the following. Divine command theory is the view or theory that God's commandments ground moral principles. So in other words, when God commands something like don't murder, right? In some sense, the commandment is a reflection of God's relation or involvement in what makes an action morally right or morally wrong. And now, again, there are two ways that one can read this. The first way is what we'll call strong divine command theory. And under this view, a strong divine command theory maintains that certain things, we'll say certain acts, are moral because, and only because, God commands them. In other words, it is God commanding you that murder is morally wrong, or thou shalt not murder, that makes murder morally wrong, right? And so it's God himself directly determining what is going to be morally right and what's going to be morally wrong. Another version, weak divine command theory, maintains that, well, it's God commands certain things. So he commands us not to murder. not because he's determining the moral standards, but because there are certain moral standards that maybe he's aware of or has direct knowledge of, and he's just kind of imparting that knowledge to us as humans here by providing us with his commandments. So it's not God's will that determines what's going to be morally right or morally wrong. That's determined by, we'll say, something else, right? But God is aware of these standards. He has knowledge of what these standards are, and then it is through his commandments that he communicates those standards to us. So we still have to follow the standards, right? Because the standards are going to be things that God is commanding. So again, it's this distinction between, is it God's will that is determining what's right or wrong, right? Or something else that's determining what's right or wrong, but God is commanding these things because he has knowledge of what's right and wrong, and he then is communicating that to us. So divine command theory, if true, in other words, the idea that God's commandments ground moral principles, if true, is going to be true necessarily if one of these two is true, right? So it's either option one or option two that are going to make this true. That's the idea behind, or at least this is going to be what's going to, in some sense, create a possible problem for divine command theory. And so here's a small rendition of the argument against divine command theory that was influenced by the dilemma that you see in Plato's The Euthyphro. And so it's a few premises, and I try to kind of summarize it here. So this may look a little bit scary, but let me go through this. Right? So we start off with the idea that, look, if divine command theory is true, then it's either going to be true because weak divine command theory is true, or strong divine command theory is true. So in other words, if weak divine command theory is false and strong divine command theory is false, then divine command theory in general, the idea that God's commandments somehow ground morality, has to be false. Okay, so we start off with this first premise. Right. The second premise tries to explore one of these options, and we just start off with the first option, weak divine command theory. Well, let's assume that weak divine command theory is true. Well, what happens? Well, if weak divine command theory is true, namely the idea that God commands certain things because those things are already moral, then that seems to raise a problem with one of God's essential characteristics, namely his sovereignty. Because it appears that God, as the creator of everything, all-powerful person, the person who's in charge of all of his creation, is not actually in control of something, right? Because his will is not what is creating those moral standards, right? And so in other words, these moral standards, right, are in some sense outside of the scope of what God is in control of. That seems to be a logical implication of the notion that weak divine command theory is true. So again, if weak divine command theory is true, then it brings up or conflicts with the notion that God is sovereign, right? But of course that can't be the case, because if God is not sovereign, then God is not God, right? So we want to maintain that God is sovereign. So what follows from that is, well, weak divine command theory has to be false. Okay, that's fine. If weak divine command theory is false, we still have strong divine command theory, right? The second option. So let's assume that strong divine command theory is true. Well, then if strong divine command theory is true, meaning that commandments are, that God commands certain things, or what makes certain things moral is merely God commanding them, then it seems that God can't appeal to some sort of principle, right, in order to determine what's morally right or wrong. Because in appealing to that principle, then we're going back to weak divine command theory, right? So it has to be the case that for strong divine command theory to be true, that God's mere willing something kind of into existence, right? There shall be light, or thou shalt not murder. That alone is what's going to determine, say, that particular act to be morally wrong, right? But then again, by not being able to appeal to some principle, right, some rationale, then that seems to call into question God's perfect rationality. Because in order for God to be perfectly rational, there always has to be something that God is appealing to, some principle that God is appealing to in order to make a certain decision. But if that's the case, then that seems to conflict with kind of the core understanding of strong divine command theory. But of course, we don't want to say that God is not perfectly rational, right? Because then that wouldn't be God again, right? So we want to maintain that God is perfectly rational. But if we maintain that God is perfectly rational, then it has to be the case that strong divine command theory is also false. So where are we left now? Well, now we've seen a kind of little mini argument for why strong divine command theory is false. We've seen a little mini argument here as to why weak divine command theory is false. But we started off with the notion that if divine command theory is true, then it has to be the case that either weak divine command theory is true or strong divine command theory is true. But if neither are true, then it can't be the case that divine command theory is true. Therefore, it follows that divine command theory in general, the idea that God's commandments ground morality, has to be false. Okay. That's all we have for this video. Thank you.